Earlier.
Can you say your name and count to 10, please?
Big pardon? Yeah, Louis V. Baldwin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we have with us this morning to talk about the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Dr. Louis Baldwin. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, you've been with us on many occasions. Every time I come with you, I have to say that because people said, didn't I see him last week with you? And I said, yeah, because he's got all of the information that we want. And I think that what we are going to talk about this morning, dealing with the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, is very important in view of what is going on in politics and during the political season at this time. But Dr. Baldwin, let's go back further than this period. Let's look at the period immediately after slavery, when Africans were emancipated, and start from there and talk about not only the 15th Amendment, but say something about the 13th and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and how important these amendments are.
Yeah, that's very important in terms of giving us some understanding of where we are today. The 13th Amendment in 1865 ended slavery. And not only in the rebel states, but throughout the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation simply ended slavery in the rebel states. But when you get the 13th Amendment in 1865, it ends slavery throughout the United States. Then you get the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to Africans, and the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in February 1870, really gave Africans the right to vote. Now the problem is that voting was never up to the levels that it should have been between the period of 1870 up to 1865. We had to have the Voting Rights Act in 1865 to guarantee that most people of African descent in this country would have the right to vote and would be able to exercise that right. So with the 15th Amendment, 1870, a very important landmark in our history. Blacks were given the right to vote, but they were never able to vote up to the levels that they should have voted. And we had to wait, of course, until the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act, rather, of 1965, which, as you well know, was signed into law on August 6, 1965 by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And that law, of course, did essentially three things. Number one, it guaranteed the right to vote. Number two, it created a federal authority to register voters in areas, jurisdictions where local officials had interfered with the right to register and vote. And thirdly, it restricted literacy tests and other examinations that were essentially based on racial discrimination, preventing people from voting. So that was a landmark. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a landmark achievement in the struggle for civil rights and also in the struggle for inclusive participatory democracy. It transformed the South in ways that the 15th Amendment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments did not transform the South to the extent that you get with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where blacks are finally given an opportunity to participate completely in the civic life of the South.
And so in a real sense, Dr. Baldwin, we're talking about the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, playing a very, very significant role. Now, I think that many of our members of our audience might not be familiar with some of the efforts used by certain elements in the southern parts of the United States in the 1870s to keep Africans from participating in the suffrage. Now we're all familiar with violence, the Ku Klux Klan, and etc. But what were some of the things that were used at that time to sort of diminish the participation of black participation in politics?
The states' rights argument was quite prominent during that time. That is, that states should have the right to decide who exercised the ballot. But Southerners came up with a number of different tactics. They used the grandfather clause, which essentially argued that your father or grandfather had to have the right to vote and had to have property and education, that kind of thing. They came up with literacy tests, the poll tax to prevent Africans from voting in that time. There were also residential requirements, property requirements that were used to prevent Africans from voting. And of course, the states' rights argument was prominent in this opposition to black voting rights in that period. And of course, we get the same thing in the last decade with the Republicans who are going back to the states' rights argument.
Okay, let's have a break here, Dr. Baldwin, then we'll pick up at this moment. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Because the 50th anniversary is important, but why is that important? Because we've got people in all these state legislations, even the state of Tennessee, passing laws that somehow restrict and prohibit people from participating.
Voter ID laws, relocated polling places,
that whole thing.
Early voting cut out.
That's right. That's the same thing. Some of the violence that was practiced by the early people in the 1870s.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, to keep black folks from, Klan and all of that, you know.
I didn't really get through that. And,
that's
you know,
what
John Hope Franklin said by 1898, blacks were completely disenfranchised
that's right.
in the South.
That's what bring all that information. I know you got that information. I know you got on that list. I don't have to be doing that list. You know, you got credibility. You don't have no list in here. Okay, very good. You know, this is 8 minutes, and so we'll just pick up and sort of look at some of the opposition to black folks. Because that's the thing, you know. And you might say something about, in spite of this opposition, some of these black folks did get a chance to get to Congress and et cetera. You know.
Oh, absolutely. John Lewis and the efforts he's making to renew and upgrade the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah. So. Yes, sir. Because it's this is going fast. This is 8 minutes coming to 9. Thank you and welcome back to the show this morning. The topic is the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And Dr. Baldwin has given us some information in reference to the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution that eventually led Africans to participate in the suffrage. Let's look back, Dr. Baldwin. I think you mentioned the Voting Rights Act of 1870. And we find that in many instances there was widespread opposition in the South in reference to this. And there was what kind of reaction that you find in the Southern parts of the United States?
With the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed the right to vote irrespective of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. Blacks got the right to vote, and we know there was a tremendous white backlash in the South with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in late 1860s, white mob groups that emerged, and the great historian John Hope Franklin says that by 1898, blacks in the South had been almost completely disenfranchised. Because violence was used also, not only the grandfather clauses, poll taxes, restrictions in terms of residency and property rights, but also violence was used to intimidate black voters and to eliminate the black voting processes in the South. And this is why by 1898 you have blacks almost completely disenfranchised in the South. So you don't have the exercise of the ballot very much at all in black communities in the South between 1898 up to 1965, when you get the signing of the Voting Rights Act into law by President Johnson.
And so this played a very, very significant role in the terms of helping to elevate the African out of the situation that many of them found themselves in because of segregation and some of the other things associated with it.
Absolutely. With the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you really get a kind of transformation from what was called the Old South to what Martin Luther King Jr. and others called the New South. The New South was that South that respected inclusive participatory democracy, which of course included the right to vote. That's why Dr. King felt that the Voting Rights Act was such a landmark achievement in the civil rights struggle, because he felt that in order to have economic power, you have to have political power. In other words, political power is a path to economic power. This is why it was so important for Dr. King, Julian Bond, who recently passed away, and others who were actively involved in the struggle for voting rights.
And so also I think, Dr. Baldwin, Africans started to appear in Congress for the first time during this period between 1870 and 1898.
Exactly.
And that played a significant role in reference to bringing black folks out to vote.
Exactly. In some of the state legislatures, meaning South Carolina, for an example, blacks outnumbered whites. So for the first time, you get people who were once slaves having the right to vote, having the right to hold political office. And of course, that was very intimidating to white Southerners at that time. So they resorted to states' rights tactics, arguments to sort of reinforce or reclaim or reinstate traditions of white supremacy. And of course, we see that going on today with these new voter ID laws. Some 34 states today have voter ID laws, some of which are very strict. They require government or state-issued voter IDs. Take Texas, for an example, which has one of the strictest voter ID laws. There, they only respect driver's license, military IDs, passports, gun licenses, but they don't respect student IDs. So what you have now today is a retreat into what happened in the past, going back to these states' rights arguments, arguing that states have the right to determine who are qualified to vote, that there is no need for federal oversight. And of course, that results from a Supreme Court decision in 2013, which essentially struck down, I think, Part 4 of the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act rather, which said that there had to be some permission from the federal government, some pre-clearance through the federal government before states could make any changes in their laws or regulations with respect to registration, voting, elections. And so what we have today is a revisitation of many of the same kinds of arguments that existed in the late 19th century.
And in other words, when folks, excuse me, talked about the grandfather clause in the 1870s after the passage of the act in 1870, today they no longer talk about the grandfather clause, but they come up with the system that means that you have to have a passport in order to...
A government issued ID or state issued ID, what they're doing also, they're relocating polling places. They are also cutting early voting days. You know, black churches for a long time, since 1965, have devoted Sundays to days of registration. They have what they call souls to the polls missions. And of course, with the cutting of early voting days, that has been essentially eliminated. So what you have here, of course, are voting rights restrictions that have been put into place that mainly affects minorities, the elderly, students, and that's really a revisitation of what we've seen in earlier days in history.
It's a repeat of the same kind of laws. It might not say that you have to, in order for you to vote, your grandfather has to vote, but if you come up with a gun restriction, I mean, voting only if you have
voting ID,
voting ID. Those are the same restrictions then and restrictions there. Receive the same kind of support.
Yeah, right. The only difference is that in the late 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, restrictions were clearly based on race. Now you have a more subtle approach to voter restriction and voter suppression, and it's mainly led by people in the Republican Party, unfortunately. You have today in 2015 what is called the Voter Rights Amendment Act put forth by Democrats, and what they want to do is to upgrade the Voting Rights Act to reinstate this emphasis on what? Federal oversight and the need for states to get pre-clearance from the federal government before they make changes in voting.
With an effort of trying to what? Open the franchise for all groups, minorities or whatever.
And to expand it.
And expand it.
Very good.
Okay, and of course what we're going to do, we're going to take this second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
President Obama has recently spoken to that, and so we can talk about what we're going from here.
That's it. That's it. That's very good. Yeah, that's what we want. Yeah, this is it. This is good information. It's just restating some information. There's nothing new in reference to this. It's just the same thing. You know, the idea is to eliminate.
Unfortunately, it's the same old story.
Same old story. Instead of trying to expand